Hello, everyone. We're very glad you're here with us. This is the Glen Ellyn Public Library panel on Native American advocacy. I am Joshua O'Shea, the young adult librarian, and I encourage you all to check out the gepl.org to discover more about the Glen Ellyn Public Library. The library in all of Glen Ellyn is on land that is the home to Native peoples, including the Great Sioux Nation, the Potawatomi, the Peoria, the Kickapoo, the Miami, the Archaeological, and the Sakowin. They were here before the European settlement and are active in the community today. So what we always want is to take what you discover here and go and learn some more for yourself. I'll change my slide to give you a preview of what we're going through. We have 4 parts this evening. The first is the historical perspective. We have Kirk Berger, the Assistant Director of the Glen Ellyn Historical Society, and Joseph Standing Bear, President of Midwest SOARRING Foundation. They'll discuss the historical presence and legacy of the Native peoples in this area. The second part is the Native student experience. Samantha Thompson from the College of DuPage alumna, member of the COD Native American Studies Committee, and member of the Potawatomi Nation. We also have Mercedes Reza, a COD student, and a member and an active advocate for the missing murdered Indigenous women and girls movement. They'll share their backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives on what it's like to be a Native person in the Glen Ellyn community and as a student at COD. Also, they will share strategies and resources on how non-Native students and residents can serve as effective allies to the Native American community. Part 3, Native Education and Faculty at the College of DuPage. We have John Paris, the Associate Professor of History at the College of DuPage and Chair of the COD Native American Studies Committee, and Cadence McCreary, COD Sociology Professor, member of the Native American Studies Committee, and a proud Seneca. They will discuss what the College of DuPage does to promote education, awareness, and advocacy for the Native Americans throughout the Native American Studies Committee, in the curriculum, and outreach to the broader Native community. Also, they will address the unique benefits and challenges to addressing Native issues at the College of DuPage, in higher education in general, and the experiences and perspectives of the COD Native faculty and staff. Our fourth section is the question and answer session. This is moderated by Joan DePiro, the College of DuPage Community Engagement Specialist, and me. The Glen Ellyn community thanks the panel members greatly for your time and efforts here and everywhere else you dedicate yourselves and your resources. I'm a librarian, got to give you a couple books here. I have 4 recommendations. Lakota America, A New History of Indigenous Power by Pekka Hamalainen. This is brand new, 2019, I believe. One reason I chose this is he set up a premise of in 1776, there was a nation that was born in Pennsylvania, and there was a nation that was born in the Black Hills. That's how he sets his premise. Give Me Some Truth is a young adult novel with Beatles music and drawings about living on reservations and in American cities by Eric Gansworth. Dakawadada Warriors by Cole Pauls is a graphic novel mythologizing and allegorizing some Native experiences through colonialism. Potawatomi Nation, Revitalization and Identity is by Christopher Wetzel. A couple of housekeeping issues. All audience participants are muted with their videos off. Please submit questions in the question and answer box. Our panelists will take the questions at the end of their discussion. Please be respectful of panelists and participants in all dialogue. This video is being recorded and will be available for public access about the end of the day this Friday on the Glen Ellyn Public Library YouTube page. Now, I'll pass this off to Joseph Standing Bear from the Midwest SOARRING Foundation.
I'm glad to be here. Ani bonjour. Many people may not know what Midwest SOARRING is. It stands for Save Our Ancestors' Remains and Resources Indigenous Network Group. And we've been around, pardon me, around 30 years. And principally, we started over saving the burial ground in New Lenox. I've worked in the Arctic, 36 states, a little bit of Hawaii, and a little bit of South America. And we've covered many, many Native issues. As it says in resources, we cover anything from food, clothing, burial, a whole multitude of things, special problems. And I'm just glad to be here tonight.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kirk Berger. I'm the Assistant Director of the Glen Ellyn Historical Society. What I was going to do is actually go ahead and start talking a little bit about the history here in Glen Ellyn. First off, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I was once Professor Paris's student at COD. So it's kind of fun being on this side of the lectern, and I think you're going to have to take notes, Professor Paris. Okay, so anyway, I've been asked to give a brief summary of the Native American historical presence in what we know of today as Glen Ellyn. I'll be speaking mostly of the local Potawatomi peoples of the early 19th century, specifically of the large Potawatomi village that was located in what we know of today as Churchill Woods Forest Preserve. The Potawatomi were the predominant population in Glen Ellyn at the time of the arrival of the first white settlers in 1834. Thanks to these settlers, we have a written historical description of their interaction with the area's Potawatomi people. Keep in mind, these descriptions, though, were exclusively written by those settlers, and we have no count of the Potawatomi's perspective of those interactions. Before we get too far into my discussion of the Glen Ellyn's Potawatomi, I should note, we know there were other indigenous people in the area prior to the Potawatomi. Unfortunately, we have no record or direct evidence of their having had any kind of permanent settlements in Glen Ellyn. But there is plenty of physical evidence found not too far from here to suggest that they may have. In 1931 and 1975, archaeological digs were made in West Chicago along the west branch of the DuPage River, which is less than 6 miles west of here. These digs, conducted by the University of Chicago and Wheaton College at the Winfield Burial Mounds and nearby village site, found evidence of people having lived there for a period of about 1,300 years, from around 300 BC and again around 1000 AD. Archaeological surveys conducted just southwest of here in 1970 at Fermilab in Batavia unearthed 17 other Native American sites. Some of the artifacts found at these sites dated from the Archaic period, or about 6,500 BC. To put this into perspective, that's 3,000 years before the pyramids at Giza were built. So we know DuPage County had been occupied by indigenous peoples for at least 8,000 years before the first white settlers moved here. Indigenous sites have been found in other parts of Illinois that date back as much as 5,000 years. I'm sorry, 10,000 years. I'd like to clarify something else. Seconds ago, I used the commonly used term of white settler. The term white settler wrongly places an emphasis on the race of the settler. It places importance on the settler's skin pigmentations and his genetics. Keep in mind, not all arriving settlers were Caucasian, which is why such a commonly used phrase, in my opinion, is sloppy and a misleading term. It would be more correct to say that these settlers were persons of a culture that originated in Europe. The story of this region in the early 19th century is a story of a shift in dominant cultures. It is not a story of a clash of two races, as the term white settler would imply. This classification is important and one I cannot stress enough tonight. The earliest written history of Glen Ellyn is a record of a pre-existing indigenous culture, one that originated here on this continent, being supplanted by peoples raised in a European-born culture. Oops, we went a little too far. There we go. So who were the Potawatomi living in Glen Ellyn in the early 19th century? What were they like? Were they always here, or did they come here from somewhere else? The Potawatomi were, and it's important to remember, still are an Algonquin people. They are an Algonquin culture. Their language is a derivative of the Algonquin language, which they share with the Ojibwa and the Ottawa. Oral traditions of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa peoples assert that at one time all three nations were once one people, one nation. Linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence suggests that they did indeed descend from a common ethnic origin, once living along the Straits of Mackinac. Together, these three nations formed a loose alliance called the Council of Three Fires. In fact, the name Potawatomi is a translation of the Ojibwa word Potawatomi, meaning people of the place of fire. The customs and languages of these three nations that they share is nearly identical. Today, our modern American political system is based on a top-down political structure. And by that, I mean that our federal government is the strongest seat of power, followed by the state government, county government, and lastly, local village government. The Potawatomi of the 19th century do not seem to have had an overarching tribal organization. The most important political unit of the Potawatomi was actually the village, which in most cases moved periodically. The village would summer in one place and winter in another. There were no elected officials per se. Each village had its own chief. The chief was not a ruler of his village, but rather an authoritative advisor. A person could follow his advice or not. His word was not law, but very wise counsel. A village could have as many or as few chiefs as it chose. The chief was assisted by a village council and a warrior class which acted as a village's safety and security force. They subsisted on hunting and gathering and supported their diet with a few grown crops. Anthropologist Ruth Landis in 1935 studied the Potawatomi, who had been relocated to the reservation in Kansas. In her interviews with older tribe members, she found that in the past, Potawatomi had lived in large villages of 60 or more families year-round. 40 of these families would set up the village in a central circle facing each other with an opening facing toward a river. 20 or more families then would set up outside that circle. Villages, of course, could vary in size and would fluctuate with the seasons, depending on the region's availability and food sources. Our first record of contact between Europeans and the Potawatomi is in about 1634. Jean Nicolet, a French trader, writes of meeting the Potawatomi on Wisconsin's Door Peninsula on the western shore of Lake Michigan. For the Potawatomi and other indigenous peoples, the introduction of an outside European culture was a catalyst for change with consequences beyond anything they could have imagined. In the mid-17th century, Europe had developed a great demand for American beaver pelts, partially because of their waterproof qualities. In an attempt to dominate the fur trade of the Western Great Lakes region, the Iroquois, supplied with Dutch and English firearms, aggressively expanded their territory westward into Huron, Sauk, Fox, and Potawatomi lands. The French, economically dependent on the fur trade, aligned with the Algonquin-speaking tribes in order to defend their hold on their fur commodity. The extremely brutal and bloody fighting lasted from 1642 all the way up until 1701, what we now call the French and Iroquois Wars. At the time, they were often referred to as the Beaver Wars. The wars pushed the Potawatomi westwards. By 1760, the Potawatomi territory had expanded into northeastern Wisconsin, central and western Michigan, northern Indiana, and northeast Illinois. We do not know exactly when the Potawatomi settled in Glen Ellyn's Churchill Woods, but it's obviously sometime during that Great Migration period. The village located in Churchill Woods was by all accounts larger than average. It was situated on a natural trading route between the north to south running DuPage River and the trail running east to west from what is today Chicago and St. Charles. Philo Stacy, who settled in Glen Ellyn in 1835, noted, "The village was a halting place for Indians on their way to Chicago, and as many as 2,000 camped here at a time." Relations between the new European settlers from the east and the Potawatomi seem to have been peaceful in Glen Ellyn. We have found nothing in our records to indicate any hostile action or intolerance on either part. Amos Churchill, grandson of Deacon Winslow Churchill, who was the first of the settlers to come to Glen Ellyn in 1834, He wrote, "The Indians were friendly but very curious, watching every move that was made. They came at mealtime and stood at the door and watched and wanted to inspect any and every package that came. So Deacon Churchill had to open it and let them see what it was." In a letter written in 1916 to Joy Morton, founder of Morton Arboretum, Joseph Liackley, who emigrated to France in 1845, wrote, "The round meadow on your place was a favorite camping ground for the Indians. They came from all directions and were most always camped here. I have seen as many as 40 come there, sometimes in little tribes or families, and they would stay 6 weeks or 2 months maybe. Then they would go to Salt Creek, and then they would come back again. They would trap from Bloomingdale clear down to the Forks. That's where all the rivers combined. The Indians went a great deal to the Bobians. He was their friend, and they were always around there." Two things to note here. First, the settlers do not speak of the Potawatomi in hostile terms or in unfriendly terms, but they do speak of them as being a separate people. Notice, not once did they name an individual Potawatomi. They are always referred to as a people who are other than us. Secondly, note the dates of those quotes I just read you. Did you notice anything odd about those times? Philo Stacy arrived here in 1835. Amos Churchill wasn't born in Glen Ellyn until 1842. And Joseph Liackley came here from France at 18 years old in 1845. So this is what's odd about those dates. In 1833, previous, the Second Treaty of Chicago gave the United States all the remaining Native American lands west of Lake Michigan, all the way to the Mississippi River. This is why the first European settlers arrived in Glen Ellyn in 1834, the following year. In return for ceding their lands, the Potawatomi received promises of various cash payments and tracts of land west of the Mississippi River. By contract, they were to have removed themselves and relocated west of the Mississippi by 1835. But in 1838, the Potawatomi were forcibly removed out of Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and were resettled forcibly in Kansas Territory. Yet it is clear as late as 1845, the Potawatomi still had a presence in our area. Was there still a permanent settlement in Churchill Woods? More than likely not, but without a doubt, large bands of Potawatomi did still travel through Glen Ellyn and stay here for extended periods of time, up until about a decade before the American Civil War. So, any culture that has inhabited a place as small as Glen Ellyn for at least 150 years has to leave a mark. That east-west trail that runs alongside the Glen Ellyn's Potawatomi village I spoke about earlier has been widened into a 4-lane street we now know today as St. Charles Road. It isn't the only Potawatomi path we still use today. Parts of Ryford Road, Crescent Boulevard, and Swift Road are well traveled long before the Churchill family arrived. Here's another neat story. Until 1918, Duane Street extended eastward from downtown Glen Ellyn only as far as Taylor Street. Past that point, there was a dirt road named Cherry Lane. In 1919, it was decided to dig up Cherry Lane and extend Duane Street eastward. There was an odd-looking tree on the north side of Cherry Lane, about 50 feet past Taylor. It grew up about 3 feet before bending over toward Cherry Lane. About 5 feet into the bend, it turned sharply back upwards to the sky. It was an odd-looking tree. Anyway, as the road crew got to the tree, they came across the skeletal remains of a Potawatomi burial. The tree, which was still there up until it was taken down in 2020, was what we would know as a Native American marker tree. Oops, let's go the other way here. Native Americans have left them all throughout North America. They would break the tree in this manner so it would act as a road sign of sorts. It's very possible there are other marker trees still in Glen Ellyn in someone's backyard somewhere. I do ask, if you see one, please let the Glen Ellyn Historical Society know. My point being, many of these markers that the Potawatomi made on this land are still here. We just have to know what to look for. Arrowheads have been reportedly dug up in Glen Ellyn gardens for decades. Last summer, members of the Glen Ellyn Historical Society found and added a stone scraping tool and pottery shards to our museum collection. Again, I have little doubt that there are still many Potawatomi artifacts out there. So lastly, what I'd like to leave you with, is I've been speaking to you about the Potawatomi in historical terms. I'm a historian, that's exactly what I do. But Potawatomi are not a people relegated to the past. They're still here and thriving. As you will hear from our speakers later on tonight, prior to 1850, it's estimated that the Potawatomi population was probably hovering around 8,000. That number is debatable. However, today there are about 28,000 people who identify themselves as Potawatomi living in the United States and Canada. Even though starting in 1834, the European culture may have become the dominant culture in Glen Ellyn, it's something to note that it has never been the sole culture to live here. That's what I've got for you tonight. What do you think about that, Joseph?
You were pretty accurate, and the physical part of that is quite true. Now I'm going to come at a little bit different angle. Over the years, we've worked on to protect and preserve many of our native sites. Sometimes it's proven to be quite difficult, but we're committed to. For instance, the Grand Village site, the Kickapoo and Leroy, we protected that and made that official site that we preserved that. Our bison herd was actually located there until December 18th, in which we gave them to the Cherokee Nation, Oklahoma. So that improved their diversity. But getting back to the sites, I thought I would best describe another site for many who don't know about it. In New Lenox, going back to the mid-90s, there was a Miami site. And our people became aware that the New Lenox Park District was going to build a pool and different park district things over there. So we started to appeal to them. And I tell this story because I want people to understand how we feel about it and the misunderstanding sometimes people have about how we feel. So what we did was we talked to the park district that we wanted to have that particular place preserved, you know, and there was some animosity as not wanting to do that. So one day we decided that we were going to get a group of people together. We had about 150 people, and we had a prayer along the Forest Preserve along Route 45. From there, we went over to New Lenox, to another park, and we had another prayer. And while we were in amongst the prayer, one of my people who was at our next stop, the actual site, he said, "Joe," he said, "you know, there's an army waiting for you there." And he described what he's seen there. And we were kind of alarmed that, you know, that we didn't want anybody hurt for any reason. So I talked to the elders and I talked to the pipe carriers and I talked to the young people. And I told them that, you know, they don't clearly understand what we're about. And I said, those that want to go along with me can. And I was very honored that 100% of them went down there. So now imagine this, it's a hot day. We're going down the road, and it's a country road, kind of dusty, and all the cars are behind. And we approach this horse, and behind the horse, there's 4 people. And we approached them, and they said, "Well, why are you here today?" And we're here. I said that we're here today to pray for our ancestors and the disturbance that you're causing to the burial ground. So they went back and they had a little talk, and they come back by the barricade, and they said, "Well, we decided that we're going to let you pray today." And in no uncertain terms, I told them, I said, "You have nothing to do with telling us when we can or not pray." I said, "We're here today to pray with our people." Now they went back and had another talk, and they come back again. Now you got to picture how big this many acres, and they had a bulldozer who was out in the field, and he was making different paths to the land. And they come back, and the first thing he says to us, he says, "Tell your people you can go ahead, but tell them not to desecrate the ground." Now, I thought to myself at first, it made me very angry because we obviously weren't there to desecrate the ground, but it illustrated the misunderstanding of our intent to honor our people. So first in line, this story kind of sometimes makes me emotional. First in line, when they moved the blockade across, there was an elder Cherokee woman, you know, and she had been wheelchair bound for a long time. Her name was Helen. And she was of that generation that particular generation didn't have any recourse to protest things that had been done to our people. So I would hard to tell you about that, but she was determined to grab a hold of her wheelchair that she was going to stand up, and she was rocking back and forth. And after a great deal of effort, she did stand on her own power. Now we had people standing on both sides of her, but she was determined, that she had enough pride that she was going to walk that eighth of a mile to that burial site. Now, what I didn't mention was the fact that we had no weapons. We were only armed with prayers and drums, and there were over 150 heavily armed officers that walked along with us to the actual site. So we got to the actual burial site. It contained Miami elder who was 75, a woman, a younger woman who was in her 20s, and a young child. And they were all women, girls. And she had been a clan mother because there was a bear skull that was buried with her. So our medicine man at that time was a Sioux, Archie White. So you have to picture, we're all standing, our native people, we're standing in a circle, 150 people, and these heavily armed officers are made two rows around us, and I say over 150. And the first thing that Archie White said, and again it illustrated the misunderstanding between native thought and their thought, and he says, his exact words are, grandfather, he says, protect these ignorant guards and their family. And as soon as he said that, now they're all wearing mirror glasses. Their arms went down, they unhooked their pistols, and their arms are hanging out, ready to start blasting. We had no guns, we had no sticks, we had nothing, just prayers and drums. So he said it again, he says, grandfather, bless these poor guards and their family, ignorant guards. And they realized that he in fact was blessing them. And when he said that, they all put their mirror glasses back in their pocket, they clipped their guns, and they put their hands behind their back, and they realized that, he honestly was blessing them. And he went on, they talked about many things during that prayer. And that started the initial 3 years of protecting that particular site. And there were days that it was 105 degrees in summer, and there was, winter when it was 5 below. And we always had a camp that was there to oversee that nothing was done to take away any of the artifacts. So eventually the park district dropped their plans to put in the pool and all that and made it into a golf course. But it was with a lot of effort to a lot of people that came and went. There was a prayer tie fence that was erected around the burial site. And many Native people from many states came, and that prayer tie fence held many prayers. And I remember one time somebody brought a postcard, a miracle to White Bison, and it was just a plain postcard, and they hung it on the fence. And the thing that was funny about that, for 2 years, rain and wind and that and snow, it didn't crinkle, didn't blow away, which I thought was kind of interesting. When it came time to the actual groundbreaking of that particular site, the mayor announced that he was going to have it on a certain day, and we said we were going to have our prayer at the same time as he did. But then somehow the rumor got started that there was going to be an explosion, there was going to be bombs and all that. And again, that's nothing what we were about. So that particular morning I thought was rather interesting. We came early, and there was 3 of us in one car. And again, this whole entourage of reporters and all these people and the guards went by us. And the mayor went by us, and I could see him counting 1, 2, 3, and you could see him laughing on his face. He thought it was comical. But when he came out, we had both sides of the highway lined as far as you can see with our people. And they just stood there and they watched him pass. And that was the beginning of 3 years of So what I'm illustrating is that we still care about our burial sites. We care about our sacred land. My travelings have taken me many places, and it's always been an honor to do that responsibility. Now, I say responsibility and not a job. It's something that those of us who do what we do, it's an obligation that we freely do that. I've spent more than 50 years of my life doing that. So that's just a little insight as to one particular site, and then we go into environmental aspects of different places. And we work with the Plum Island with Pat Quinn. We did save that. And many, many, many victories. But I've always told people, you win it with the power of the heart, not the power of the fist. And we've been very successful with that. Just honored that to be able to share that story tonight.
Well, it's an absolute honor to have you, Mr. Joseph. I appreciate that. All right. We want to hear from some of our students. Samantha or Mercedes, would you care to take it away for us?
Of course. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Mercedes. I am a student at the College of DuPage. I'm studying human services with special regard to addictions counseling. I have been going to COD for the last 4 years. I actually started going for my nursing degree and decided that was not really the path I wanted to take. So I basically had some background in advocacy starting from when I was 18. I have actually been on my own since I was 18. So I don't have a lot of family. I don't have a lot of people I could go to ask questions. Now, in regard to my family, majority on my grandmother's side had come from Mexico. Now, my grandfather was a traveler, as they called him, and he was mostly in the Oklahoma and Texas area. So my mother was born here in Illinois, and then here I am. And as far as educational attainment, I'm the first one in my family to go to college. Though it's a community college, it is something that I have a high regard to being able to show, the path to my younger ones, my children, and my family, who are kind of in this cycle, as we call it, and is stuck. So to be able to be this advocate, I'd like to also show people in my community that I'm a human being. I exist. I have, had some hard times. And though my area and my community at the college have been, very supportive, been understanding, and have been there to be able to help me get to where I am, to find my identity and to find the person that I need to be in this community. It has a big impact. And as Samantha and I met each other just about a few years ago, I was actually passing in the Commons, and I had seen a big sign for the Native American Studies Committee. And I kind of was like, wow, this is pretty interesting. Let me stop by really quick. And I had seen a big map of the United States. And it didn't have your states. Instead, it had your tribes. And it just created this light bulb in me, because as I was growing up, I knew I was different. I knew I was not as, your typical Hispanic. I speak Spanish, though I feel that my language has been kind of cut short because of growing up in a society where English is the main language. You must know that, you must follow that, and if you don't, then you're far behind. So that's something that has changed in the last couple of years, because as Native Americans progressed and been forced out of their cultures, forced out of the language, forced from the traditions, I'm happy to be able to go to resources like Midwest SOARRING Foundation and other members like Samantha, and just kind of connect. So I feel like that's really important, especially nowadays, that we have this connection with our members of the community to ask those questions, because it's okay to. So as far as like being an advocate, I mean, it's, what does it mean and what does it mean to me? And it's just like to promote an awareness and to defend our people's rights, and to be able to speak up for those that have been silenced. So one of the main things for me is advocating about the awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now, we had a roundtable a couple months back about this, and it's still a very big issue in our community, in the United States, and even across the borders and around the world. Now, in regards to Natives, it has an impact for the way that we objectify women, how we objectify our culture. So I want to just say, I like care about educating those that don't know what's going on, and just being able to promote this awareness. So that's my role, as a student, and as a mom, as a daughter, and as a friend, and as a student to my community and everyone else. So when we were asked this, I was eager, because I don't really know many students who are like me, besides Samantha. So just to say that in our student body, we have over, 8,000 students, maybe more. Don't quote me on that, but to just know that there's only 2 of us, it's kind of a big deal. So we want to be able to know, you're there, we are aware of you, we exist. So yeah, and when I asked Sam, I mean, how does it feel to know that, I'm there with you? And she's just, right, Sam?
It's a great feeling. Also, before we get too far into it, also, I am Smith Thompson, and I will be first introducing myself the more Potawatomi traditional way, which is explaining my ancestors. So, grandmother is Glen Ellyn, grandfather Don Ellyn, great-grandfather Lester Willis, and great-grandmother Dorothy Willis. The reason the Potawatomi and the Algonquin tribes do that is because, how I've been told, of course, is that our ancestors are always around us, always with us, so you want to acknowledge them. You don't know who's listening. And like Mercedes said, it's a great feeling knowing that there's other natives. So I've been at COD for 3 years now. I officially graduated 2019, came back in 2020 for the Native American Literature class. That was great. So in that whole time, I have met, other than Mercedes, 3 other natives. 2 of them through the Native American Studies Committee, one of them in a Native American history class. That has been it. If you look at the demographics of COD, Native Americans make up 0%. We are 0.1 something percent.
Yeah, definitely. So, and just to have that number signify like what we are, though, we are there, you feel me? And when we had a conversation, Sam, it just being visible means that we're acknowledged, and that we have this voice to scream out.
When you mentioned you use your advocacy to speak for those who can't. And I think that's one of the reasons why I am so loud in talking about that I am Native American, because my grandmother couldn't, my great-grandfather couldn't, my own mother couldn't. She couldn't prove that she was Native. All of my family members carry this card that proves we are Native American, proves that we are a part of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. You ask any of my family, they will pull out this card. Mm-hmm. But up until my mom was in college, she couldn't. because our tribe had officially closed the enrollment section. We still kept the rolls, so that's how we knew who people were, but to the government, we had closed it. Then later when we opened it, we made sure that there was no blood quantum rule. So you didn't, as long as you could prove that you were Potawatomi and you were descended from somebody who was enrolled in 1870, I believe it was, around there, you were Potawatomi. We believe that if you have a blood quantum, it will get, which is a blood percentage, it will be harder to reach that percentage each generation. So you are effectively killing your own self, making yourself deluded and causing inbreeding and such.
And that's where it comes into play about our similarities and our differences. Because as a Native, there is this visual that we are supposed to look a certain way, have a certain skin tone, certain hair color, certain eye color, though we are very diverse. We have had certain experiences that are similar. For example, us going to school and being able to connect like this. Though growing up, I didn't know my ancestors like that. I don't know my genealogy. Whereas you were able to tell me that you can go date back 4, 5, 6 generations and know who mattered in your life. So that's something that is very hard for newcomers, as you want to say, or someone just really searching for their identity.
And a lot of the Native American communities that I've been in, we don't really look down that much on people who are like you, Mercedes, or anyone watching who have had these family histories of Native American members, as long as you are doing it for the right reasons, because you want to connect. Mercedes had mentioned when we were talking before of this feeling you had talked about inside, like missing, having like that kind of feeling. Now, granted, not everyone has to have that if you're Native and it's not a check mark you have to check. But having that feeling of like when you listen to power music and the drums and you just feel your soul just like heal or just be relaxed, all that negative goes away when you listen to that. That's what happens with me. And like Mercedes said, I knew my family growing up, we were Potawatomi. Always learned about that. We weren't very traditional in everything that we did because we are urban natives. My great-grandfather lived in Chicago. My grandma was raised in Chicago. She was raised in the south side of Chicago. So they had to pretend to be Italian while she was growing up. And that is something that I will never stop talking about because people don't realize that. It wasn't so much the forced simulation we had, such as through residential schools and boarding schools. It was more society telling you, hey, pretend you're Italian. We won't ask questions, we'll just assume. And it's funny because the things that we do, my family does that I didn't realize were traditional Potawatomi things. Knowing the lineage, talking about who your family is and your ancestors. I didn't realize that was how we introduced ourselves until last winter when at Midwest Soaring's winter storytelling event, one of the members, Nick, had explained it. And that's kind of when something clicked in my brain that went, oh, that's why.
Right.
What's interesting about that is the concept that we have to have a reservation card in our own land. I find that kind of ironic.
Well, and yeah, we're the only race that has to prove our pedigree, like show dogs. And some of my friends who look the stereotypical Native aren't registered. One of my aunt's best friends is 100% Apache, I believe, but she's not registered or recognized.
It's interesting to read one of the comments. It's that Native Americans had to pass as white in the same way as lighter-skinned African Americans benefited from passing as white. And I agree with that because in our conversations, that in this assimilation, we had to blend we had to follow through just so that we could pass and just get by day to day. Because if not, we were discriminated. We weren't going to be sitting down. We weren't going to be getting those resources. We weren't going to be looked at respectfully. And it's a shame that that is something that we still have to deal with in 2021. We are dealing with this now, and especially with our Black and Brown brothers and sisters. So this is something, again, we are advocating, we are raising our voices, we're sharing these experiences, because this is something that is going to keep continuing. We have this loop that goes on, but we are able to change that by having these conversations and opening up the board to our community. So
And it's still, my family, and at least me, I'm still benefiting from being that lighter skin. I don't have to worry if I'm traveling up into Canada about being one of the missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Mhm.
I have to worry because I'm a woman in general.
Right.
But I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about the fact that Natives are 25% more likely to be pulled over because people don't look at me and see Native.
right.
I've had people tell me that when they first saw me, they thought I was just some white chick. Which is then why in every conversation, 5 minutes in, I mention I'm Native American.
Right. Or you get the question like, what are you?
Yeah.
Where are you from? And those questions alone is just the microaggressions. Like, no, that's not okay. You know what I mean? Even though we are in the United States of America, free speech, that's something that, there's a little tipping point. Like, you can't say that. You can't ask that for me.
Almost immediately after talking about being Native, I get oh, what percentage? Or how much?
I think when you talk about that, it contributes to the lack of self-esteem, which has a ripple effect down to our highest suicide rate amongst our people. Now, that's definitely a part of that whole ball of wax.
There, in one of my sister's textbooks, there was a photo of a woman, and she was tanned, and in like the negative space on the tanning, it says, "I tan to look more Native." The fact that whenever I dye my hair black, I feel so much better for some reason, just because it's that tiny bit more of, oh, I look a bit more Native now. Or highlighting the cheekbones.
This idea that we're supposed to have certain features to be considered Native enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Even though, like, can I talk about the Potawatomi bred early on with the French? We've always kind of been known as this lighter skinned tribe. But mainly because, yes, we bred with the French and the traders, but also we're from the Great Lakes area.
Mhm.
We don't have that big of an exposure to the sun like those in the southern hemisphere.
Exactly.
It's odd, Samantha, that you say that, because if you read back some of the old French historical descriptions of the Potawatomi, they describe them as very handsome, beautiful people. It's kind of like they're bigger than we are, they're prettier than we are. Yet it seems like that connotation has changed over the years somehow, or that vision of what a Potawatomi is. And I'm just using the Potawatomi. And while doing the research for this presentation, I had a chance to speak to someone who is Potawatomi that was from Glen Ellyn. And she was talking about, she's from the Pokagon. I think I said that right. I'm not certain if I pronounced it right. But growing up, she and her mother always told people they were Greek until later in her life. I hope she's out there listening right now. No one's saying names or anything like that. But to see how that actually changed over time is interesting, and I'm hoping it goes back. We'll see. So.
And it's always the different perspective. In our Native American literature class with McGrath this year, there was that story that depicted natives, the settlers saying that they looked so handsome and beautiful. It's that kind of exotic look that we have. Mm-hmm. That is also another contribution to the missing, murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah.
Can we bring in Cadence into the conversation here? Maybe she'll have some thoughts on this and other things she wants to say.
Okay, it's Candace.
Thank you.
Okay. In the introduction earlier, you identified me as Seneca. That is what I'm going to say, the white identification of my people. We are actually the Onondaga Haudenosaunee. And that's one of the things that I wanted to correct you, Kirk, on, was that on your map, you show us as being Iroquois. Iroquois is actually a word equivalent to the N word to African Americans. You need to be aware of that. It is a word that came from the Huron. The Huron hung out with the French. The French Francoized the word that the Huron used for the Haudenosaunee. And basically the British picked it up from that and basically addressed the Haudenosaunee with that word. And then they couldn't understand why they were being scalped. The I word itself is equivalent to the N word. We do not use that word at all. Listening to Mercedes and to Samantha, it brought back memories. Because yes, we have been an invisible people. You look at me and most people say, well, you're something, but you look more white. And that's true. My grandmother was Onondaga. And because of that, when I was born, and I was born in the early 50s, just so I am old, back in those days, you identified people by their race on their birth certificate. You were either 1/8 or you were a drop of blood. And because of that, my birth certificate says that I am Indian, but no, I am not enrolled with our tribe. So there's that strange situation that many of us have that have been identified as Indian, but yet we aren't recognized by tribal affiliation. I would greet you all with the Sigeno. Yes, I was taught part of the language, and from what I understand today, there's only about 50 people who speak the language. And as I have gotten older, I have forgotten it. There's not that much more of it that I remember. Now, in the sociology department, we do teach in the introduction to sociology about all the major ethnic groups in our society of African American, Hispanic, Native American, Alaskan Native, the Hawaiians, the South Pacific Islanders, the Asians, those are all taught. We also have a race relations course. And to be honest, I do not teach that course. Those who teach it, schedule their own way of how they want things taught. I do talk about my ancestry in the intro classes. And the reason being is that most times people today think Native children being taken away from their parents, that ended back in the 1920s, 1930s. And I hate to tell you this, but that is still occurring today. Native children are still being taken away from parents because they have been identified as special needs. And especially in Oklahoma, where the state has figured out a way of making money off the federal government. I myself, when I was 5 years old, was taken from my parents. They had to sue to get me back. And they got me back at the beginning of the 3rd grade. And we left northern Pennsylvania and moved to California. I was basically told by my parents, never talk about my ancestry, period. In other words, I was taught to pass as white. When I went to college, I went to the University of Southern California. Yes, I identify as other. I don't conceptualize myself as white. I don't conceptualize myself as Haudenosaunee. I mean, I have a mixture of my background. I mean, I have ancestry from Germany, I have Scotland. I mean, it was all mixed up. It hasn't been until the last 20 years that I finally started figuring out which dishes went with which culture, because it was all thrown at me. And nobody ever said, well, this is the German dish and this is why we do this. This is from the Haudenosaunee culture and this is why we do this. It was just all mixed up. A true melting pot, if you would use that term for my life. But overall, even today, we are still an invisible people because we represent less than 2% of the population. I had to argue with a sociology author who did a textbook and left out Native Americans. And I had contacted him and asked him why there was no mention. And he said, well, they don't exist anymore. And that was like a stab in my heart. And it's like, what do you mean? And he said, statistically, you don't exist because you're less than 2%. And I realized what he was talking about, because to be recognized in our society, you have to be at least 8 to 10%. And because of that, statistically, yes, we are invisible to the rest of the population, unfortunately. But I would say that things are changing. Here at COD, we have more recognition. Most of the other colleges in the area don't have anything like a Native American Studies Committee. I was rather impressed with that. I am still hoping that possibly we would develop more ethnic studies so that we would have a semester on each one of what we identify as racial minorities within our society, so that people could study the culture, the language, the customs, everything of each one of the groups, because we've all contributed something to this society. It's just a matter of being recognized. Josh?
Could I add one thing there? Talking about the early school system of our kids being taken. Have any of you ever seen a movie called A Boy Called Horse? Excellent movie you need to watch.
Yes. It is significant. It's true. And the fact that children today are still being taken, I know in Oklahoma, up in Minnesota, it's happening. And it's tragic.
Candace, first, thanks for the correction. I appreciate that.
Most people don't understand and have never been taught that, because we are such a small nation. Mm-hmm. Most people don't know that the history of that word.
But the one question I did want to ask you is, do you feel that some of the way that Native Americans are viewed as regional in the country, so that the way they would be viewed in Southern America, I mean, by that I mean the United States, the East Coast, Midwest, the West, do you think it varies depending upon area?
It does, because in the areas where you would have heavier Native American populations, they are more attacked. For instance, you go into the South, you will see African Americans. Where you go into Minnesota, you go into Wisconsin, you go into the Southwest, and you will see Native Americans harassed because they are the majority population. And that's just our American culture. because we stand out. Believe it or not, last fall, I drive a Mercedes-Benz, and I was driving in a rainstorm, and there was thunder going on, and I was wearing a hoodie because I didn't want to carry an umbrella because of the thunder and lightning going on. And I was literally pulled over. I was frightened for my life for the first time, because as I watched the two police officers getting out of their squad car, they were literally taking the safeties off their horses. And I had no idea why I was being stopped, but it was because of the hoodie. They actually thought I was African American. And that is something that happens to anybody who is non-white, that we're stereotyped.
Going back to what Kirk was asking too about regionalism, just my own informal sort of observations. In Illinois, there, as Samantha and Candace have pointed out, the percentage of people that are Native American is relatively small. There are no Native reservations in Illinois, even though there are many Native people in Illinois. But if you just go a little further north into Wisconsin, there's a higher percentage of Natives, especially in northern Wisconsin. And obviously there are a lot of wonderful allies to the Native community in all parts of the country, and that hopefully that trend will grow as we move forward. But I think what I've observed is in a place like Illinois, the prejudice and the racism that I've seen as an outsider tends to be just sort of the ignoring, like you've been pointing out many times, kind of you don't exist, or oh, I didn't even know there were natives here, as opposed to a place like maybe Wisconsin or out west in Montana and places like that where there are a higher percentage of natives, and the reaction isn't you're not here. The reaction is sometimes from those that are not allies, more antagonistic. So it's like pick your poison kind of a scenario that I've observed. So just kind of to add what I've observed to that. I guess maybe I can just say a few things. I don't really know what else I could lend. This has been just such an amazing learning experience for me. I've just enjoyed sitting back and listening. My role in this is just to kind of tell you a little bit about what we do at the College of DuPage to help bring Native American ideas, culture, issues, history, and people, to allow them a forum to speak their voice through the auspices of the College of DuPage, which is centered right in Glen Ellyn. And all I have to say is just, we've already seen, right, that the Native presence dating back 10,000 years, the present, and looking to the future. So I'm the chair of the Native American Studies Committee at College of DuPage, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about just who we are. We do many things at COD, and we certainly are striving to improve all the time. So every time we have a conversation like this, there are new ideas. There's just a myriad of ideas in my head right now of things that we can talk about at our next meeting, everybody. How we can promote Native American identity and culture and just presence to the next semester and beyond. In our curriculum, we have a number of Native courses. Samantha made reference to the Native American literature class. We have a Native American history class. Certainly, that's something we can certainly improve upon in other disciplines as well, like Candace mentioned with sociology. So that's something we are constantly striving to improve upon. And we in the Native American Studies Committee are committed to working with, folks in different parts of our school to try to, improve the curriculum to make it more representative of this diversity. We also have a wonderful anthropology department. The anthropology department, everybody that I know that teaches there is very proud to do what Kirk did and talk about the ancient cultures that were indigenous to this region, but as a way of shining a light on the present, right? One of my good friends and colleagues who might be watching here today, Dale Simpson, always likes to say, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. It's to kind of highlight the accomplishments and the glory of ancient civilizations and the ancestors is a way of highlighting the present as much as the past. And as Samantha pointed out, the idea of honoring ancestors. So that's something that I'm very proud that I'm part of College of DuPage and associated with that mentality and that kind of emphasis when it comes to Native studies in the anthropology department, in the history department, in the English department, and many others. Our committee is comprised of everybody. We are open to anybody and everybody. So we have people, as you know, here today that are members of our committee that help to keep us very authentic, and thank goodness, that are Native, that are speaking their voice, that are sharing their stories and sharing their identity with the broader community. There are people that are non-Natives that are just allies or hoping to become better allies through this process. We partner with a lot of groups in the area, such as Midwest SOARRING Foundation, as Joseph has talked about the wonderful work that they do. Many other local organizations like the American Indian Center in Chicago and the Trickster Gallery in Schaumburg. Those are other wonderful partners of ours that we have good relationships with, and we try to present Native American issues in history and culture, again, from a very authentic standpoint, letting Natives speak their voice and having a forum for cross-cultural learning and understanding. We do a certain amount of outreach, right? We're trying to initiate a program as we speak to try to provide more PPE equipment to Natives in areas of America that have a lack of that, as the COVID pandemic is still ongoing, of course. So I guess my little kind of part here is just to talk about how we have a Native presence at College of DuPage. We emphasize and honor Native peoples. There is still a lot we can do more, and that's a constant struggle and a constant push forward. And that's something I personally, as the chair of this committee, look very much forward to, working with Natives, serving as effective an ally as I can be, and allowing Natives to kind of just say, here we are, from the past, in the present, and moving into the future. So I don't know what else I can say other than thank you to all of you for raising your voices and sharing your stories and sharing your identities. Did we want to start the question and answer period at this point, Josh?
Yeah, I am doing some controls with the video and with the chat. Yeah, I want to echo the thanking all the panelists for being open, for being honest. There is legitimate struggle and frustration, and there is almost just as much hope and determination. So thank you for sharing with us and for leading us. We have a couple comments, and then I have a kind of an open-ended question from one of the attendees. We have a comment that that there are a couple of oak trees at Churchill Woods that date back to when the village would have been was early on. We have someone mentioning a similar feeling to the discrimination that people who are Black or people who are Native, and if someone is Muslim going to Canada or other places, they've had experiencing repeated pullouts from the line for extra checking. So yeah, we've got a problem, we've got a major problem. And as someone in the privilege group, I, as well as a lot of other people, I'm just flat out embarrassed and don't get why it exists. So I think that we're in a real position that we can work to change, which is why I'm glad you're here. The open-ended question for all of you from one of our attendees is, how does it make you feel now that we have a Secretary of the Interior who is Native? Yeah, we got a big thumbs up. I saw that and I was like, yeah. So whoever starts talking, I'm going to pin you as soon as you start talking. So
I have great hopes that she proves to be what everybody hopes she is. I always like to see someone's work before I pat them on the back.
Right, yeah. I want to see what they'll do.
I think also with her having been identified as Native American and being the Secretary of the Interior, we're starting to hear, just recently, 2 weeks ago, it was brought out that we've had a Native American vice president of the United States
I was
that,
just
you
gonna
know,
mention him.
because of that, we are starting to hear more of the history that we've been part of that you've never heard about.
Samantha,
Oh, go ahead, please.
Samantha, were you saying something about?
Yeah, I was gonna mention. I was gonna say I hope that she gets remembered as being the Native American Interior Secretary of Interior, because no one really knows that we had a Native American vice president. I believe it was Herbert Hoover's vice president, Charles something. Even I barely know it.
I'm hoping, I'm sorry, go ahead, Professor.
Oh, I was just going to point out that for those of you that don't know, that the Department of the Interior was the cabinet level department that oversaw the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it's not just a random cabinet department. It is something that has a direct connection to a lot of the issues we've been talking about in the 19th century, the 20th century, and today. So for her to head that specific department is even more just amazing and full of promise and hope. Kirk, you were going to say?
Yeah, I'm hoping that also it lends some power to some of the native peoples in, say, North Dakota, where the pipeline is, who have been totally ignored because they don't have the political power to defend their own lands. And if people don't understand what's been going on there, I think it's been over the, if someone knows the more specific, jump in. But I believe over the last 6 years, they've been building an oil pipeline that would run right through Native American lands, more importantly, through the only water sources that those people have. Early on, there were promises that we have new technologies, don't worry about it, everything's gonna be safe and fine, this is not like Alaska. And I think it was within 2 years, they've already spilled 38,000 gallons of water and polluted the entire area. So I'm hoping that somebody in a place of authority might be able to actually express a voice and protect the people who at this point don't have a voice within their own state. Even though they might be the largest population in that state, they have no political power. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Kind of, especially considering how I've always been taught, no president has really been very good with the Native. Most countries don't know how to handle their indigenous population anyways. But we have had presidents range from like Andrew Jackson, who did the Removal Act and has been recorded in history as having skinned natives and used their skin as whips for horses, and leather, the piece of leather that you sharpen straight raised blades on. He had one made out of Native American skin. That, when I learned that, was very angry about. But we've also had presidents who were quoted as saying the only good native is a dead native. Or how we're even written about in the Constitution, which is Indian savage, around there. It uses savage in it.
We just covered this in the U.S. history class that I teach. Thomas Jefferson wrote all men are created equal in one part, and then later on he said, merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So people, men are created equal, yet separate from the term men or human in the most demeaning and vilifying terms in that same document. So then that right there in the birth certificate of the United States, we have that paradox that that you're referring.
What made it then easier for them to try and eliminate us. They didn't see us as human, so they had no problems trying to kill us. And talking about the history and how we don't teach that much about it, when we talk about how women got the right to vote in 1920s, only white women. Native American women didn't, or Native Americans in general, didn't get the right to vote until all the way up until about the 1970s in certain states. We didn't get the right to be citizens until 1920s. So my great-grandfather wasn't a citizen of the country that his ancestors are from. And the fact that our right to vote isn't given by the Constitution, at least how I've been taught, it's been given by states. And a lot of states find a loophole around it by making it you need an address instead of a P.O. box, which is in a lot of reservations.
Well, we have a question that asks, what can we do that's opposite of all that? What is a good, what do you want from a good ally? Any of?
Learning about it like this, make sure, and when you are learning about it like this, make sure you're doing it because you want to learn about it. It's not because you think of us as this majestic, noble thing. Sherman Alexie has in one of his stories this great quote, even though there's some allegations against him, it's a great quote about how white people look at natives with the same wide-eyed wonderment that they look at the full moon and waterfalls and newborn babies. I've even had that experience when I've talked about being native, of like a teacher basically in her head just being like, wait, I have a native in my class, like a real one? Oh my God. A fascination people have where it's because we seem exotic or an other to them. And Mercedes, in your Myth and Modern Indigenous Women panel, there was a great quote the woman had of stand with us, not in front of us. So, and I even try and make sure to do that as a light-skinned native. I try not to talk over people when they talk about the problems they have as darker-skinned natives.
You know, John, I have two comments. We used to say about the Bureau, if your house caught fire, call them last. And the other thing you mentioned, the pipeline, that was a very much understated, heroic effort by many of our people. I was there for a short while. It was a tremendous effort, and they suffered greatly many times. So I have nothing but respect for our warriors. Now, ending my part on a positive statement, there's a totem pole that's been standing in front of Pilcher Park Nature Center for many years. And recently someone brought to my attention the poor condition it's in. So we presented yesterday night, the Joliet Park District, a proposal to correct the paint job and bring a totem pole back to life again. So it goes back to about 1900, give or take 5 years. So they were very enthusiastic about that. So the tide of change is coming. And what I found interesting is at first they were not that interested until we started talking about the spirituality about a totem pole and what that meant, and that the colors that were on there were inappropriate. And, you know, I believe that that's a teaching aspect. And I'm proud to say Samantha is going to be one of our 7 people that's going to restore that. So I'm proud of you, kid. You've done a good job there. So it's been, over the last 50 years, just a really interesting thing to see the evolution of thought process. From times where it was, you know, in regards to the chief issue and things like that, that were definitely not easy issues to be there and undergo some of the things that happen there. But thanks to a lot of people who had the courage to stand up.
Joseph, can I ask you really fast before you depart? One of the questions I saw here was asking specifically about local powwows. And if you wanted to just talk a little bit about Midwest Soaring and the powwow planned at DuPage Fairgrounds this fall.
I'd be honored to talk about that. We have one of the finest powwows in the Midwest. And I've given roughly about 55 over the years and participated in, you know, hands-on another maybe 10 or so. Powwows have definitely changed to what they used to be. Used to be that a car would pull up and have mom and dad, grandpa, and the kids. You'd have, you know, 7 dancers in one car. There's not as many dancers as there used to be, and I kind of blame that on a little bit on technology. We're evolving to a different place than what we used to be. We still have many people that care very greatly about that. And at a good powwow, at one of ours, we might get anywhere between 7,000 to 10,000 people a weekend. And that's the engine that keeps us going. You know, it serves a lot of different purposes, not just a cultural event, but a unity thing amongst our different people, and that we have a place to express ourselves and to have a good time. So this year we're tentatively planned for October 2nd and 3rd, depending on the COVID. So that all depends on how it's going to shake out. But I think that powwow is in this area critical, that we have that our young people can still see that we're still dancing and still enjoying ourselves. It's just a very special time that we have.
And I think Josh, right at the very beginning, posted the website address for Midwest Soaring, so you can get more specific information from the website as well. I can put in here the Native American Studies Committee information too, for those of you that are in and around College of DuPage that want to get involved. Remember, it's not just for people that attend the school as students, it's for all staff, all faculty, and community members. So as you can see represented here, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, some former students, some just people I know, some colleagues, all part of the committee. So those of you in the COD area are all more than welcome to.
John, I appreciate that. Our address here is 133 West 13th Street, Lockport. And we're located in the old 1860 limestone train station. And our hours are flexible, so always call ahead. But we do need more volunteers and more spirit.
Speaking of that, Joseph, we have some questions that have kind of all fallen into the same category. People are asking about how to be an advocate and an ally. They feel your pain. They thank you. We've got 5 or 6 people who have just thanked you very much for being so open about this. But what can you do to support Native American? How can you be an ally? How can you be an advocate? Support Native American literature? Just some ideas of where we could go from here.
Well, that's a good question. And what we're doing, we're setting up a movie and book club here at the center. But basically, by participating and helping us do larger events, it helps us tremendously. We're very involved in environmental projects. And I have a whole long list of things I need and want to do if we have enough people to do them. And I believe that, you have to push yourself away from that technology, the phones and all that as best you can, and remember to be who you are, to give thanks for each day. We do that, so welcome volunteers. I treat everybody in Soaring equally. I believe in the 4 colors. Creator put those colors there for us to cooperate in a good way, and I would much rather extend the heart than the fist, always.
I'm not Native American and I'm not from the culture, but one of the things that I was trying to point out today is a lot of what Native Americans have done in this country. All their landmarks are still here. I think we need to educate ourselves to help preserve that and bring that back to light. Professor Paris was just mentioning a while ago that in Illinois in general, we think it's an end of it's gone. It was long gone. It's something of history, which is not the case at all. I think part of what you can do is in your neighborhood or wherever you are, is start researching what was there, what is still there, and learn how to find it and see those signs. Honoring the past doesn't have to come from your culture. We all learned, we've all grown out of some at least shared lifespan. I mean, I talked about the trails that I walk every day today are still the same. Churchill Woods itself, someone had mentioned that there were ancient oaks there. It's not just ancient oaks. It's one of the few natural prairie lands left in Illinois that is just like it was prior to 1830, before we had European settlement. There are plants over there that don't exist anywhere else in Illinois. So preserving that, remembering that shared history and culture is something that you can do as well. Preserving burial sites. You got to find them first, okay? But once they're there, don't tear them up, honor them. show them the respect that they're due. You wouldn't do this at a cemetery down the street here. So doing things like that, trying to find these other sites, the paleo sites. I am sure there are tons of them out there. I am sure in my heart, though I'd have no evidence, that Churchill Woods, the village there, is older than the Potawatomi. All the natural resources are there, and it wouldn't make any sense that it wouldn't have been settled earlier. But we have no way of knowing. Not right now, but that's something we can work on and tell the story better, tell our story better. And I think that's something we can do, speaking as a non-Native American. So
I would say one last thought too, is that this being spring, we just had the spring ceremony a couple of days ago, that I encourage each one of you that's listening to go out and plant a garden. No GMOs, protect the water. Don't depend on stores to provide for your well-being. You provide for them.
Professor McCreary, do you have any final thoughts?
Oops,
Oh.
you're muted. Sorry.
I think that for people to be allies and advocates with us, they have to, when they hear people stereotyping or making negative comments, they have to stand up if they truly want to stand with us.
Agreed.
Add to that, and to kind of add to the learning about where you live, acknowledge and know, and talk about how there's still Potawatomi stuff here. Acknowledge and learn about the fact that almost every town around here has some kind of section of street named Navajo, Cherokee, Seminole. There's words and things that we don't realize that are native. Chicago is an Algonquin word. Illinois, Delaware, Miami, those are tribe names, or the English version of the tribe names, like Candace mentioned before. A lot of what we call different native and different tribes now are the names given to them, oftentimes by their enemies, or mistranslation. And when you do learn about Native American stuff, also acknowledge and know and be conscious about the fact that our religion is a closed religion. So not everything we are going to share with you is meant to be used for non-natives. The Midwest SOARRING Powwow has a great time when it's open to any non-native or any native in the intertribal dance. Prior to that, there are etiquettes and protocols you have to follow because it is religious ceremony. Something like Kirk mentioned, if you wouldn't do it at your own cemetery or your own church, don't do it with Native Americans. Still a religion, still a people.
Mercedes, any final thoughts?
Yeah, so my thing is just preserving our natural habitats. In the state of Illinois, we have prairies. There are about only 2% of our prairies left over. And those natural habitats have been here for centuries, for decades, for a long, long, long time. So when I see from Laura, useful botanical knowledge, yeah, that's important, especially in the fact that all of our native plantings are being destroyed, our areas being built on. So preserving these and knowing that these prairies are important to our communities also, that's informative. Also, a couple other resources that I have been able to go to as a Native woman, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They offer lots of resources and can answer some questions there too. They're dedicated in providing resources to Native women. So, and that's not just to women in regard, there's obviously the LGBTQ community and men alike. So I just appreciate, everyone allowing us to have this time and this floor to be able to speak up. So thank you again, everyone.